My name is Angelina Avadano, and this is InterSpace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Dr. Gena Glickman recently retired from her position as president of Massasoit Community College and retired in 2018 as president emerita from Manchester Community College in Connecticut. Her background encompasses more than 45 years in public and private community colleges and universities, including experience leading a college through significant change with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Glickman recently started a consulting practice to support community college leaders in diagnosing institutional challenges and leading institutional transformation. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Gena Glickman. I am here today with Dr. Gena Glickman, who has joined InterSpace podcast to talk to me a little bit about women in leadership, her experience in higher education, her desire to move forward in helping others transform culture in these areas of higher ed and business. And I'm hoping that we'll also have a rich conversation about the culture of competition versus collaboration in business and higher ed and the emotional intelligence it takes to navigate such difficult waters. So welcome, Dr. Gena Glickman, to InterSpace. Hi, Gena.
Hi, Angelina. It's really wonderful to be here with you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And we first met when you came into the college where I was working as our first female president, which was a huge honor to watch that unfold. And since that time, you have retired from that position. So congratulations on your retirement. But I know that as with most folks who've retired, it seems as if you may be busier than ever, having started your consulting business, East Bay Higher Education Consulting Group. And I'd just like to know a little bit more about what your vision is for that, and so that we can start this conversation about transformation in higher ed.
So my original vision was to form a collaborative of women who have expertise in different areas, and to be able to reach out as a network if someone had a particular question or need in a certain area. So for instance, let's say someone had a financial issue on campus, that my group would have an expert in finance that I could refer. Because really among the women leaders, in particularly in community colleges, it really is about who you know and what your network looks like, and that's where the trust comes in, to be able to reach out to someone in order to get that kind of web of expertise that you might need. And what it really seems to have turned into, which has always been kind of the underpinning of it, was how do we buoy people up, women leaders, both experienced and inexperienced, to know that they can reach out to someone who may not be part of their daily life, but who they can bounce ideas off of, who they can reach out to and say, I've got this situation, this is what I'm thinking about doing, what are the pros and cons of that? So the mission really is to help people be more confident leaders in their own choices that they make, and to be able to have a peripheral vision about those choices that are opportunities for them. The other part of that is that rising leaders, people who have an interest in leadership from whatever position on the campus that they might hold, often are, especially women, are more tentative about than men tend to be more tentative about speaking up and speaking out, and so they need kind of like a test. They want to test their perception, their idea, and how do they broach that in any particular situation. And then there are those people who just are seeking those jobs and don't know how to present themselves. I recently reviewed a cover letter that was 18 pages long. I looked at the job announcement and I said, well, there are two things here. One, you're talking about all of the things you had to do to fix the problems that existed. So you've just basically said that you're the person you succeeded in the role did nothing for 10 years. or everything they did fell apart and you came in and magically reinvented. And that doesn't speak to collaboration and respect. And so the networks are very tight. And so an 18-page cover letter, and a 5-page resume, who's reading that? And what's the point that you're trying to make? So those kind of underpin all of the reasons why I wanted to do this. And one of the most important things is that we need good leaders, we need strong leaders, we need leaders who aren't afraid of, what's going to happen next or afraid of a decision they might make. Because this is all about how do we create success opportunity for students and keep people who are in those institutions vibrant and innovative and interested.
Yeah. Well, I think I was so happy to witness your arrival as a woman in this position as the president of our community college. I know you have 45 years of experience in higher ed, and during a time in which women's roles have really shifted. And so I would just like your perspective on what you've seen over the course of this time for women, what maybe some of the insights that you have gained through that process to get you to that point, but also then perhaps how far have we come, and then how far do we still need to get?
So I think community colleges actually have come further than universities have. And part of that is a shifting need in community colleges. So women tended not to go into the sciences, not to go into finance, and they started in student services, which is where I actually started. In terms of my administrative career, going forward, I was a counseling faculty member in the softer disciplines. And that was not a trajectory that led to a presidency. That may have led to a deanship. When I started, there were no vice presidents. Everybody, was a dean or associate dean were the titles. They were not corporate related titles. So that changed. But you didn't find, the network that women needed that men had. And the political network, the old boys network, and so if you were to look around at who were presidents when I was coming through the ranks, they were all men. It was not diverse, and it's not to say they were bad leaders, but there were not women at the helm, and it was the odd situation where there might have been a woman in finance, or there might have been a woman president who stepped in as an interim and then it succeeded the person who had been in place. But you also saw a lot of men who stayed in jobs for 20 years, 25 years. And in Massachusetts, in fact, I think the last 3 women presidents that were hired after a more than 20-year or about 20-year career presidency that preceded them of white men in those roles. And so they were and there is something about a male leader that gets an automatic level of respect and deference that is not given to women. And I think it's that deference that is really, for better or for worse, it puts the women who might have a softer style or more, I always say, I might appear to be laid back, but don't be fooled, because you won't fool me. And I think that sense of deference, though, is not what particularly men or women on campus who have been used to having a male leader are even used to or familiar with. And so as a president or even a vice president, I spent 10 prior years as a president, and I was for 5 years as a VP. and I also was associate provost at a university when I was younger. And so there was both the age, the casualness of style. So you see a lot of women now who, wear their hair very short, wear pearls, and, the traditional kind of business look about them. That's loosening up as more and more women move into those roles. But I think that is one of the challenges, particularly now women of color. The woman that I mentioned who had the 18-page resume is a woman of color who wears long dreadlocks, and and she's very there's a lot of the cultural background that comes through in her style and appearance, and that's starting to be much more acceptable. There's not a dress code or a style code. On the other hand, it makes it harder for people to defer to her leadership, to her decision-making process. And so that is something that women are always having to navigate. And that, I think, is something that over time has changed as you have more women come through and rise to leadership positions, and especially as those leadership positions become more diverse.
So what kinds of cultures in higher ed have been environments in which you could thrive as you have grown and into this position and come all this way? And then I'm going to also turn that around and say, and what cultures have been those that have been toxic and have made it impossible for you to thrive? So
let me start by saying I can thrive in chaos. So because some environment is toxic on campus doesn't mean that I can't thrive in that environment. What it means is that it's harder to get anything done in that environment in terms of moving the institution forward, because there is such imbalance of power, really, at the college and or in an business environment. I mean, it is so often when a deal making, especially when you have a woman president. This has been kind of experientially noticed. I've noticed you have a woman president following a long tenure of a president that people deferred to, even if they didn't like decisions. And so, as a woman, you come in, and it's always what did Dylan Kennedy say about culture? It's always the way you do things around here. And the woman walks in and says, but the way you've done things around here means that nothing has moved in the last 5 years. There hasn't been anything innovative. There hasn't been any permission to even fail to move things forward. So I think those environments that are toxic, which are so much easier to talk about in so many ways, because they just have so much grist for conversation, is the dynamic that has occurred between management and collective bargaining, or between governance structures and what a governing structure believes is their level of authority and the president's level of authority. Or there was a recent discussion that I think the legislature even got involved in at a community college, where they actually were either terminating or reversing a termination of someone outside of the authority of the president who manages the institution. And it's made the higher ed journals. And so sometimes at all levels, what might not appear toxic, but really creates an environment that's ineffective, is all of that back office, that back room, all those old shared assumptions that create culture is different now. And so that when you walk into an environment like that, the only way to really thrive is to break it down into, it's like, how do you eat the elephant in the room? It's bite by bite, right? You have to be able to look at those things that are successes and build on that incrementally, so that people in the organization feel like there's movement, there's possibility, and that one faction doesn't have any more power than, a negative faction doesn't have any more power than a positive faction, and it's really about collaboration. The interesting thing about it in higher ed, and particularly in community colleges, even when you have that toxicity in terms of relationships on campus, they typically, although I noticed this at, where we were, is people stopping forward momentum in terms of curriculum or a redesign or transferability, but there was a commonly held value about students and being student-centered. Some more successful than others, but people did have that shared sensibility about the reason they did their work, or what, for the most part, why they were there. And they played a lot of games on the side, but ultimately, to a person, I think students came first. And so even though there was all of that other nonsense, if a leader can help kind of part those waters so that the true mission of the institution can be met and everybody's on the same page about that, the other things can be worked out. But changing a pattern of shared assumptions that a group learns, and that's how they solve their problems, is, a lot of adaptation. And I think that that's just, it's not something you are, although a lot of people will hold that, those views so close to their heart that they think that it's something they are, when it's really something they do with those characteristics. So the place where you really can thrive and feel like you're moving is someplace that's really centered around mission. And that's, people often say, well, I'm not sure I really like this job. And my first question is, do you not like the work, or do you not like the environment? Because that environment takes a very long time to change, to change a ship. And I noticed it, when I was at the college, that the minute I stepped away, the largest fear from people around me was, are we going to step backwards? Because that forward momentum, you want to give it enough seed time that, it's going to grow, and at some point, some deer may come along and eat the buds, but the plant's going to be there. And I think that's really an important thing to think about. I think anybody can thrive in any one of those scenarios as long as they feel like there's possibility.
Yeah. Well, and as long as there's possibility, and also perhaps some form of support. And I think that is what it is you're trying to do. But you've said something to me in a conversation we had before about this, that, ultimately at that level, when you're in the presidency, you have to look around you and realize that in many cases, here you are, a woman at the top of this leadership position, and you are alone. You are alone in that moment. And I know that you have created East Bay Higher Education Consulting Group to come in and step alongside those people who experience that aloneness, or that realize that. But could you talk a little bit more about that? Because that seems so isolating to me, and like that for me would be hard to thrive in that kind of environment. I'm a collaborative type of person. However, it was very insightful what you were saying about recognizing, you have to be able to assess. You're navigating very political waters, and you have to be able to assess who you can trust, and just how, and evaluate just what is actually possible and within your control.
It's a very, one of the things that's sort of interesting to me is it's a very isolating role. You're very isolated. You are one. You always have to remember that you have the role of the president, but that's not who you are. Anyone in that role is going to experience the same thing. The difficulty that I found, and I'm kind of getting my arms around it now, is that, especially now that I'm retired and I'm no longer that person in the organization, I don't have that level of influence, I'm not, but I did recognize how much of my work was also my social engagement. But one of the things that I learned early on, and I think that it's really hit home recently, when I left my first presidency, which was a long tenure, it was 10 years, I built what I thought were some really strong, healthy relationships. And then I realized when I left that really a lot of those relationships were healthy work relationships and work friendships, and especially those in my organization. And there are one or two people who I've been able to continue to have friendships with, but I've noticed that it's hard, because even though I feel close to them, they're really not my a confidant, and they can't be in a lot of ways because they can't play that role. And I remember once having a therapist said to me, not every friend is the same level of depth. Or, you can have your movie friends, you can have your coffee friends, you can have your work friends, and then you can have those friends who know every part of you in that kind of deeper, long-term friendship. I have a friend who I've been friends with since we were in high school together. And I'm going to be 70, so think about that one. That's over 50 years that we've known each other. And that's a different kind of support that I might have. And I think that the other kind of support, which I actually find really hard because of my business, is that some of the women who are reaching out to me now are people who I would reach out to when I was working alongside them to say, I've got this situation, what do you think? And so now I'm sitting there saying, well, I'm no longer sitting alongside you, but you can have me there through my business. So it's a little bit strange. But I realized when I most recently left the college, that I lost a lot of what was that camaraderie of experience. And I recently had lunch with someone who, from the college, and it was just really wonderful to be able to connect. But I'm still always the person who was the president of the institution, and not the person that, that's going to have a more personal interconnection about life in general, or relationships, or, it's going to be a little bit more, it's not going to be best friend. And there were people when I left the college who I thought were really had more depth of a friendship, and that just wasn't the case. It was you were important to me then because you were in a position that influenced my role, and that was that's a lesson to learn. And I think there are always lessons to learn along the way, no matter who you are, about where you get your strength from and where that network is. And because it is one, you need the internal people when it's an isolating environment, especially when you're navigating through something difficult. But there's always that sense, and sometimes you actually uncover it, that someone on your team that you assume is on your team is going around you in other ways. And so, as you mentioned, knowing who you trust and understanding that the most important person you trust is yourself, to make a really good decision for one, to protect the institution, to protect the students, and to make sure that people feel good about the work they do, so that they feel, as you mentioned, supported in that work. And that is a lonely kind of thing to do. And it's, I haven't really mastered how you do it, but I do know that for me, the business that I've decided to start and the work that I do at the search firm is really about letting someone know that there is somebody they can reach out to. I placed a dean recently, and the person that I spoke to, the firm doesn't necessarily do this, but the person I spoke to, I said, look, if you ever need anything or have a question, feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you with other people who have been in your role that are outside your institution. So don't ever feel like you are, on your own. And I think women do that for each other, but I think sometimes pride and inexperience and not knowing who to reach out to also adds to that sense of isolation.
Well, and that does bring us to this idea of culture, because I would say in my role as a professor and even in doing my own personal work, whenever I am having difficulty in a class, if for some reason, as you know, every classroom that you walk into or every Zoom meeting classroom that you attend or you begin, it's a different dynamic. And you could be teaching the same exact group of information to two different groups of individuals and have a totally different experience. And so there have been times when I've been in this classroom environment and for whatever reason, the dynamic is not connecting. Students are connecting with the material. For me, the answer has always been, I've learned over time, sometimes it's frustrating for me, but the answer is always to be more vulnerable and more authentic with my students. And I don't often want to do that. That's like the last thing I feel like doing, especially when I'm feeling inadequate or when things aren't gelling. But I have seen over time that is what usually breaks through. Now, you're not going to reach everyone, but the way to break through. But this is not the case in what you're talking about, because you don't have the luxury of sort of being vulnerable in a position of this power position that you're in. So I wanted to talk about that and, how you navigate that and what you think about that idea of vulnerability as a part of actual problem solving and empowerment in a way.
So it's interesting. When I was doing a workshop on culture, one of the people that I had a video of was Brene Brown, who talks a lot about vulnerability in leadership. And it's not the breakdown in tears, when things aren't going well in front of people. But I think it's more about transparency. And I think it's also, when you are making decisions, is letting people know your thought process and how you came to look at it and where, but I do think it starts with this idea of culture and the kind of, one of the things I think is really hard when you're trying to navigate a culture is the icons, the artifacts of an environment are something that help you recognize what a scenario is going to be like, about what an environment's going to be like. And I think it's really important when you have a physical office space, particularly leaders mostly do, is that they reflect who you are. So, Zoom backgrounds kind of help because it allows you to pick an environment that reflects who you are and what you're up to. But if you can use your own home, that also opens up the sensibility of, this is who I am, this is how I live. And that is a sense of transparency and reality, and I think it's the same thing in a classroom because everybody is bringing something different to the table. So one of the first things I think is that you are able to share the artifacts of your life, and that that whenever you're making a decision, you're coming from a position of particular beliefs and values. And that you're sharing those kinds of aspirations and ideology and kind of rationalizations, and that you're very willing to listen to those around you. But the bottom line is, we've got to get through this material, or I really need you to have some greater understanding of this so you can think more broadly about the next issue or problem that you need to solve. And that even with all of that, I'm going to have your back. I'm not going to just disregard. And I think the idea that you can even say that is a sense of vulnerability that you open yourself up to. It's like, I don't have all the answers. I don't know that this is the right move. I only know that this is what our students need, this is what our community is looking at, and so I'm going to prioritize that because that will help support other goals. I think it's harder to be vulnerable if you're not willing to share a little bit about who you are and how you came to those beliefs. And I agree. The more vulnerability that you show in, especially the classroom, of saying I have a couple of students now, is I don't know how to reach you. Tell me what you need from me. I had a student recently, I advise dissertation students, and this young woman said, the way I do it is I have a running dialogue on their chapters that they're working on. So notation in the margins, marginal comments, and they respond to my marginal comment. They can say, I'm not interested in I don't agree with you, or I agree with you and here's the change that I made. And so my one student who said, I have to use a clean copy. Every time you make a marginal comment, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make the change, and then I'm going to delete the comment so I have a clean copy. And so I had to write back and say, I really appreciate how this is difficult for you, and it's a different sense of being and what you need. But it means that I am rewriting and rereading and making mistakes going forward because I'm asking you to do things you may have already done or wasn't clear to me. So we both need to find a way to do this because this is how I work. And I didn't say, well, and you don't really have any choice about advisors, but the fact is that I had to be as willing to say, basically, you have to defer to me on this because we're not going to move forward unless you do. And yet, at the same time, have her understand how difficult it is for me when we can't be on the same page for that. And knowing that it's a challenge for her, but also how difficult it is for me. And so this is a method that I use now with all the students, and we use in the program, in fact. So that sense of vulnerability, I think, is part of being able to share your beliefs and assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned before that beliefs and assumptions are what create culture. And so I want to come back to that because one of the things that I have noticed as I have stood at a distance, as you know me well, I'm not really all that excited about diving into the political fray. So I like to watch from the sidelines, but what I see is two competing models. And it's not just in higher ed, it is in business. I think it's honestly sort of the way maybe personalities are geared in the world as well. But I think it's all informed by culture and the way that we believe that we should be behaving, growing, learning, changing, and succeeding or failing, actually. And that is a competitive model versus a collaborative model. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I see this playing out and kind of in tension a lot in the academic setting, but like I said, everywhere. And I think these things are really sort of coming to a head. And the competitive model, which has allowed us a lot of progress, a lot of innovation, a lot of technology and advancement, and so has collaboration. But it has been championed. The competitive model has been championed as really the way to be in American culture, specifically in capitalism and in our governmental system, in just our identity, the American identity of American dream and achievement and expansion and even just our love of sports, right? So we are steeped in competition psychologically. And then we come into these spaces where we're trying to educate, we're trying to grow, we're trying to change, we're trying to thrive. And in my view, a competitive model can only take us so far and ultimately starts to break down. And this is what I think that we're seeing today is a sort of cultural shift that says this model isn't really effective. It's not sustainable. It's not going to work in the long run to keep us from destroying ourselves in many ways. So I just would like to get your perspective on the competition versus collaborative model for essentially everything, and then see if you believe either there's a mix of both and we kind of have to have a balance, or if we really are going to have to let this old model die and move to a collaborative.
Well, I don't know that the old model is ever going to die because people are, as you mentioned, it's kind of ingrained that there's always a winner or a loser, and if I can get this award, then someone else isn't going to get the award, and many of the people who work in our institutions are solitary individuals. By that I mean they're scholars doing their own research, spending a lot of time on their own as experts in their field, in their discipline, in their work, and they rarely, even in a department of people who are, I think about departments of artists, there may be like groups of people that have similar beliefs, but typically they're all coming at something from a different angle. And so there's always that sense of dialogue and, whether or not they walk away from it feeling like there's been a collaboration of effort in order to have a common set of learning outcomes, for instance. There's always that, oh no, you've got to include this word that reflects my vision of whatever. And so they never really learned to collaborate, or they learned to collaborate when they were little. If you watch little kids, they, it's always, oh, no, I want that toy, no, I want that toy, but they learn to play together. But somehow they grow up in this, it rather than it being a kind of competition with yourself, of how much more can I do, or how much more can I accomplish, or how do I move forward? A lot of the people that we're working with are people that are very insular, and they're not even used to reaching out except when they're dissatisfied with something or things aren't going the way they want. And then it's a generational difference too. More senior faculty to more junior faculty have very different ideas. I remember talking to someone who I think has kind of been problematic recently, but was very afraid to broach his department on change because he knew he wasn't going to get anywhere. And it was like, well, but who are you doing this for? Can't there be some sense of collaboration as opposed to a competition of you have to lose in order for someone else to gain? And then who really is losing? It's not you. It's the students who aren't going to have the mobility that you need them to have, and or the experience that you want them to have. So I do think that this idea of assumptions and that these do determine behavior and perception and thought and feeling. But I also think that culture's like a superglue. It can hold an institution together. It can be that bond that unites people and helps them to accomplish something. But you have to get people in the same room doing the same thing. And remember that trying to even put together a governance structure at the institution, which is a shared leadership model, was like, no, we're not going to do that. We have this, this is the way we do things. I'm like, I don't really care how long this takes. And I had colleagues who said, you must be crazy because this is going to make decision making for you more difficult. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, but if people aren't all engaged and debating, that there's not a win or lose, but a best practice sounds sort of, trite, but the most effective way to help students move forward and to keep the institution vibrant, then let's try and do it in a shared model. But you're right, that breaking down those barriers to having really shared leadership, shared responsibility, shared understanding. That's a very challenging thing to do, and I think our institutions were thrown into this like tailwind of tornado this year that basically said, oh my God, how do we even move forward in this bizarre environment where we have to connect and everything we're connecting is remote? And yet it brought people together. I always think groups of people do really well when they have a common enemy outside the institution. Then they band together because they're protecting their institution, the place that they have committed to. And so
that's that super glue you were talking about, right? That's
that super glue. If you could, in some ways COVID has really helped that super glue form.
I want to talk a little bit about this idea of culture and your goal and your mission to work to change that and transform culture, because I know that was a lot of your vision for the college as you came in, was to transform the culture there. Whether or not you felt like you were able to do that, we can talk about that, or maybe the challenges that you faced in doing that. But I know that you recently put together a workshop that you did for UMass Dartmouth Emerging Leaders Program. And I wanted to talk a little bit, since I know that this bridges higher ed and business, how you see the relationship between those two things and this culture, and what it was that your work in that workshop was trying to say about culture and transforming culture.
Well, I think that one of the things I was trying to say was that it really is in large part based on mindset, and that is Carol Dweck's mindset theory, which is either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, and that having a fixed mindset is really going to put you at the same place that Kubler-Ross does with her, what happens when you're dealing with death and the cycle that happens, and the fear and the transformation that occurs as you come out of that, the fear, the depression, all of those parts of her theory. And part of that is, if you're looking at it from a growth perspective, a growth mindset perspective, then you're going to profoundly affect the way you do things, the way you think about things, and break through some cultural, what might have been cultural icons or cultural artifacts, and start to look for those cultural icons and artifacts that really represent where you want to be. And and some people would say, well, branding is one of those things that you can do to create a new identity that people can look at. It's not that you're dismissing the former, but that you are managing to reflect who you want to be. And I remember one of the things, and it was sort of interesting because it was really, there were two things that happened. One, we got some award or recognition for being one of the safest campuses in the country, and it was like a national thing, and we did very well, and we did very well in terms of Massachusetts as well. And one of our board members didn't want to talk about that because she was afraid that if you talked about how you were a safe campus, that there'd be an assumption that you were not a safe campus. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, where we were located, there was a perception in the community that it was not safe to be on campus on your own or walk around at night, and so maybe people were afraid to come. And yet it was one of the safest campuses it's one of the safest college campuses in the country. And so you want to say, how do I create that perception? There was another scenario of, we really are the College of the South Shore. Why don't we say that? We're not Brockton. we serve 37 towns or 36 towns. So why aren't we identifying ourselves as this larger, broader impact to a much greater community that changes the way people think about us, that changes the way we think about ourselves? And so it's not, sometimes it's not about the one-on-one relationship, although I did, when we were chatting, talk about how the minute you have one person in the room, you have one sense of culture. You put someone else in the room and there's going to be a conflict. And it really depends on how you broach that conflict. And everybody will say, oh, I can tell whether or not that person's a good fit in 30 seconds. Well, give me a break. I mean, you can tell whether or not they look like you, they don't look like you, they dress like you, they don't dress like you. You don't have a clue other than that until you start to talk to somebody and ask questions and find out who they are and how they think about things. And unfortunately, there's very little time to do that, and people take very little time to do that. So I think in a lot of ways you have to sort of see it, catch it, check it, change it. I mean, you need to have the emotional agility for mindfulness so that you can really listen, which I think creates trust, and that leads to empathy and connection, and that's what brings people together. And without that, what you have are kind of a series of tasks and things that need to be done, and it's very rote, and it doesn't, it's that, do you remember that Lucille Ball show where like they're on this chocolate line and it goes too fast and they're like stuffing stuff in their hat and their mouth, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're doing a really good job, we'll just go faster, this needs to go faster, and you're like going,
right.
You're not taking the time to figure out the best way to do it, the best way to engage. And I think that the Kubler-Ross thing really helps you understand those stages of grief, which is really what you go through when you go through stages of change. You go through that kind of shock and anger, you go through that confusion, kind of disorientation, and then that kind of new energy.
I think that's such a great connection. And of course, that I'm going to light up because that bridges my own work. But it's also because when there's change, there's a loss. You're going to have to let go of something, and you need to make space for either individuals or a group or an institution to grieve that loss, to acknowledge it and validate it. But you can't move on to the change without doing that work. And I think that that's also is part of that hurry up and just get where we're going, and without really being thoughtful about those processes, like you're saying, which I love that image of Lucille Ball. But I think, to me, what you're saying also resonates because unless we are aware of that work in ourselves, we're really not going to be able to manifest this on a collective level. And so the work that you're talking about is great, but the fact that people are so often unconscious to our own, breakneck pace, our own unwillingness to slow down and be thoughtful about what is motivating our own resistance to change, or, the fact that we're feeling uncomfortable with the unknown, or the fact that we're going to have to give up some of what we consider to be our territory or quote unquote power in order to allow something else to emerge. And I think, that in itself is its own vulnerability.
I think it's really hard because people are going to resist anything that's untried, where they lose a sense of security. Their identity is in play, right? They felt competent in their work that they did before, but this is ambiguous, right? So who knows what it's going to look like? They had a sense of belonging, which they now have to reconstruct. They don't know what the future looks like, and they need to feel safe. And so in order to feel safe, you protect yourself. On the other hand, in order to feel safe, they have to be engaged. They have to be supported. And so people need to feel safe, but they also, at the same time, they need to be able, the trust needs to go back and forth. And and trying to establish that while you're making change. And frankly, when a new leader comes in, there's going to be change, right? It's not a clone of the person who came before. And so just the physical presence of a new person is may mean a different way of looking at things, or a different sensibility. One of the first stages is to like unfreeze things. You have to create the motivation to change, and I think that's really that first stage is really hard, because it's the core of the cognitive and emotional structure that you have to break down, and you've got to be able to identify those issues that, from the new person that's heading the organization to everyone in it, is that fear of the loss of power and temporary kind of incompetence to know what they're doing, or that fear of punishment or loss of identity. And I think you're right that people don't view that. They don't think about loss. They think about, they're more in denial, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think too, so much of what you said and all that uncertainty speaks to safety. And the reason that it's so hard to reach the first step of, unsticking things and being willing to experience the change in the first place is because it will require you to be unsafe. And the illusion of the whole entire structure is that we're safe to begin with, right? Because everything will always change, but we really are in denial, as you said, in that we think that we can get to this place and there's not going to be change. And yet we experience it over and over again in our lives. It's no surprise that things are always in a state of change, and yet we're always in a state of a denial about that change. So I think that just the unwillingness and that resistance is a huge hurdle, but I don't know how we help people to be comfortable with recognizing that safety is actually in the emotional agility and the emotional intelligence that you were talking about, rather than in the fixed mindset. It's in the growth mindset. It's in the agility is where the safety. It's like learning to surf instead of being battered by the surf, right? But that's a shift in mindset, as you were saying. And I don't know how you make space. Either you come in with that, you're born with it, it's part of your personality. Do you see people actually making that shift?
So I think that if you can unfreeze and you can change that sort of create enough disequilibrium to kind of force the motivation to change, then I think you could move to the next level. And the next level would be, of course, the actual change in learning process. So I think that it is that second stage, if you can get through the first, that you have actual change and beginning to have a learning process, and that those mechanisms by which we learn new behavior and beliefs, sort of imitating a role model or identifying with a person who we trust, sort of scanning that environment, kind of trial and errors, we kind of invent solutions. I think that's the investment of time to help people move forward. And that's in any, therapeutic situation, or some boards have said this when they're hiring new presidents, is I really don't want someone who's been a president before. They're just going to come in and do things the way they did before. And of course, what you want to say to the board is, no, someone who is mature enough and sophisticated enough is going to come in and assess your institution and say, this is how this institution needs to be moved forward. This is how I can help you do this. I've been at one institution for a long time, but frankly, it changed every year, every day. There was always something new perspective, new people, new goals. And so it is, I think, you have to be able to provide visible models and I wanted to say that once you get through that unfreezing period, and we look at what stage 2 in the Kubler-Ross stages of grief looks like, is the actual change and learning process. And I think that certainly if you can provide models and experiences for people, that they can begin to make that change, that process. But that first stage is so important and so hard to manage. And I think part of that, is, as we mentioned, all the loss we talked about. But what I wanted to also add were some ways that leaders can help that unfreezing process, that motivation to change occur. And part of that is to provide a really compelling vision that people can get their arms around. That you provide formal training, for it, which when we think about how we pivoted in COVID, we intentionally set aside 2 weeks before we would even have students come back to provide the formal training that faculty needed to feel comfortable in making that pivot, that change in the way we were teaching and learning. We involved other people in the process, and you will see that in our governing structure. That kind of provision of resources and models and that kind of underlying support really helped remove barriers and built new structures. One of the things that I noticed, and I see this in leaders, younger women particularly coming to me, they've only worked in one place. They've only experienced one institution. They haven't seen how other institutions work. They've not been involved in collaborative, discipline meetings or meetings across other people in their field. So they themselves are isolated, and trying to break through that isolation, even when they're interested, is teaching people how to network, how to build their own kind of sense of community in the institution and then outside of the institution. So I think those are things that are really critical for success. And I think, as you mentioned, I was the first woman president. For me, I had been the first woman president prior. And what I realized was how influential just that was for so many of the people on campus, because they hadn't seen it, they hadn't experienced it, and I think that kind of brought a whole new way of thinking and being and freedom.
You just said that, so many times people are limited by the fact that they've had an experience in one place but in not another. And so I would say that you mentioned that you were the first female president before in your 10-year tenure. And then at this latest, your three-year tenure at Massasoit Community College. Since you experienced that in two different ways, in two different places, did it change the way you felt about that? Because you had one experience and then you came in to this, which was a completely different set of circumstances, not to mention, not least of which was COVID, right? At the end. So, who would have known? Like, who would have thought? So I just wonder what you learned about your identity as a female president, as a woman in leadership. What assumptions did you realize you had when you came into the second position? Did it help you to evolve and grow? And how so?
So what's interesting to me personally is that I took some things for granted, and that is that I left an institution where I had built relationships, where people knew who I was, where there could be a dramatic something going on campus and somebody would come and say, I need your help. I knew everyone's name. I knew their story. I knew everything about the institution. I could practically cite every policy that we had, or any situation, or as my memory held. And there were no surprises from people. They knew what to expect from me. Now I came in and to have to change an entire culture of people who were used to a very hierarchical approach, who would come in and say, well, I know you're interested in this, so how do you want me to go about it? And I would say, you're the expert, you tell me. And it was like, oh my God, I have to come up with this on my own. And people really rose to the occasion, and I had some incredible talent. I also had some very difficult personnel decisions at the same time, of mistakes that were made, and just people who were not a good balance for me. But I also had 10 years of experience, and that meant 10 years of relationships, 10 years of being able to just go someplace, and lived in the town. So I knew everyone. It was basically a small town, and I was a very visible president. Corporate, fundraising, all of that. And Massasoit was very different. The institution didn't have relationships externally. The people were more isolated. There was more territorialism. Now, there might have been that in my beginning of my presidency, and I just don't remember it, because I broke through those barriers, and I could stand up in front of the academic senate and say something, and people knew I had their back. I had a lot of support. Over time, they trusted me. Now, there were people who would say things that would at the head of the union, I would say, Carl, not happening. Or whatever, and I'd push back. On the other hand, if there was a promotion decision that wasn't correct, and he would come and he'd say, look, I don't understand how this came to be. Same person, how did this come to be? And I'd say, tell me more, and it might get reversed. So there was a mutual respect for the way we did business. Massasoit had none of that. There none of that level of sort of, walking into a new situation where you're kind of used to having people just a little bit of deference, a little bit of understanding. I remember I had some health issues at one point in my former job, and I had a faculty meeting, and somebody said, well, you've been gone. Are you looking for another job? And I said, no, I had some health issues. I was gone. They said, well, why didn't you tell us that? We were so afraid you were going to leave. So when you say vulnerability, being able, so they make up stories. But when I got to Massasoit, there was so much already in place of this kind of lack of trust, lack of engagement on each side, that if you made a step in one direction, or said something in another direction, or indicated that you needed to do one thing, everybody got their guard up, because the former administration, or the person that I succeeded, had a particular way of doing things that was very isolated, very hierarchical, or or decisions weren't made. No governing structure, no sense of shared governance. And so young faculty coming into a scenario where there was a very heavy collective bargaining structure that didn't move things forward. I used to say there hadn't been a new program in 5 years. The continuing ed department that basically said, no, if we keep our head down, then no one's going to challenge us. And it was like, what? And so there was this automatic kind of sense of distrust. And part of that could have been, well, she's going to say exactly, she did, even though she had a good experience where she was, she's going to bring all that here. She doesn't live in the community, whatever. So an automatic sense of distrust to get over. And that was, so my first year was basically spent working with the board and the community to say, no, here's what we need to do. And finding out that many of the people, or some of the people who had been promoted or were in administrative positions, weren't really qualified to do the jobs they were put into. And so I managed a lot by asking questions, and that made a lot of people nervous. And that's where that safety piece was challenged. I couldn't really help them for not feeling safe, but I could say, I need to understand the institution, and if you can't do this work, tell me what you need to be successful. But so often they weren't at that place to be able to do that. And I think that was one of the challenges I had. And actually, I will always say that the minute we had to go into a COVID response was the minute that people started trusting me. Because, now they might have had some trust and some, but I hadn't been there but a year, maybe a little bit more than a year and a half, maybe at that point, when I had to make big decisions, and I had to trust the team to handle those decisions. And I also knew I came to it with a very underpinning of the most important thing at this point for me was taking care of people. And the most important part of that was making sure that they had their livelihood and that they could do their jobs. And that I was not going to compromise that the best of my ability. And I also, talked to our PR person and said, I need to be able to communicate with people every day. And we need to share pictures, and we need to talk about what's going on in our lives. And even the union, who is the most controversial, competitive, pushback, people in the union leadership would write me emails saying, thank you so much for taking care of us. And, I hit a brick wall myself, or that, this is what we need to do. And that was in response to George Floyd's murder. That was in response to Pride Month. That was in response to my engagement with people on a one-on-one evening email, information sharing, talking about my own scenario and where I was and what was going on in my family. And, as much as I could be vulnerable about that, but kept people informed. And I really believe that was a turning point that accelerated that turning point.
Yeah. And I'd have to say, as we're coming to the end of our conversation, I'm sure that the way things, again, with COVID, but the way things unfolded at Massasoit was not the way you thought it would when you first came. So you too had to be open to change, had to be willing to let your vision, the way that you had it in one way in your head, die in order to, kind of pivot and reframe what it was you were going to do. Then you decided to retire. And even though you were building your consulting group, it too also kind of evolved into something a little bit different than what you intended it to be. So just as we're closing here, I see that you're also modeling the very activity that you're bringing about. And isn't that the way it always is? I mean, whatever we teach, whatever it is that we're forwarding, for me, whatever I happen to be writing, it's going to come up in my own life personally. And so it just seems to me, I would like you to reflect on that as you have had to really you've really had to do this work. You're living it. You're embodying the very work that you're doing with your consulting group. Do you see it that way as well?
I feel the changes, and I often question, what I did, how I did it, what I went through, and it does really, though, as you said, kind of speaks to when you walk into an environment, you think you're going to find one thing, And I actually think that happens a lot, that you think you're going to see one thing that was the experience that you thought you had, and that made an organization or a new job appeal to you, feel like a good fit, and then you walk in and you say, oh my goodness, I know I've been a change agent. I actually thought that, there were other pieces already in place to build on here, but realizing that there was so much, and I actually even had the board add a goal that was basically a structural organizational goal to their strategic goals, to say, you need an infrastructure. You're operating without an infrastructure. You have goals to raise lots of money, or you have a goal to, create new programs, but you haven't invested. You have a lot of money sitting in in case something dramatic happens at the institution, but you haven't set a baseline of how much you really need in that pot, or a baseline of what you will invest to make that reality happen. So you need structure built in, and I did not think I had to build that structure. And so that took some doing. I mean, what college or university doesn't have a governing structure, beyond the existing board, and, level of decision making is totally within the president's power. But, change in culture means change in power. And so in some ways it was a real learning, and it's a real learning experience for me to both give up that power, determine where that power should sit in that president's office, and to be able to disperse it at the same time that you're making change that maybe some people don't have the authority of a positional authority to feel like they're participating. And so you have to build that into it. But yeah, it was really different. But I like that work. So while it wasn't what I thought I was going to be doing, it was in a way I kind of say it's why I landed there. And I only hope that work sustains itself, and I'm glad I did it. And in some ways it's my life's work. And that is the contribution that I hope that I make to the future of higher education, and whatever that's going to look like. I'm fortunate to have been named chair of the board of the of CHIA, which is the National Association for Accreditation that all our regionals and specialized accreditors belong to, so that I stay within the experience of being able to, engage with the work that I've done for 45 years. That's a big change not to have the level of influence in that positional authority.
How has this last 3 years changed you as a person?
That's a really good question. I learned patience. And I think I really learned what was important to me in my career, and what and the importance of building people up, because I never, as I get older, I'm going to be 70 on my next birthday, there wasn't a way for me to start over in a career. And all of a sudden I realized that the next generation of leaders is right there. I teach them. I'm their doctoral advisor. I'm their faculty member. And I finally understand in a lot of ways what my husband, who's a faculty member, and what you as a faculty member, you actually see the change occurring in people, in their, the light bulb moment, the understanding about how they reflect on something. And I got to see that in all the professionals that I worked with. And for me, I mean, I see it in students, but I think I realized the influence that they can have, and how I can help guide them, and that and how personally what is really important in life, in work, and that's, bringing your values to the table and living them every day.
Well, that's a really beautiful way to complete this conversation. And I just want to thank you so much for being an inspiration and for the service that you have given to higher education all these years, to the role model that you are for women in leadership, and how you are moving forward to continue that work by partnering with us as we grow and expand into positions of leadership and beyond, and also just becoming more self-reflective as people and human beings and helping one another ride these waves of change that we are all going to have to become comfortable with, because they're coming and they're happening. So thank you so much for your work and for taking the time to talk with me today and being a part of InterSpace. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Angelina. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Great, Gena. We'll see you soon. We'll talk again.
If you'd like to reach out to Dr. Glickman about her work at East Bay Higher Education Consulting Group, you may email her at ebheconsulting@gmail.com. That's ebheconsulting@gmail.com. You have been listening to InterSpace with Angelina Avadano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avadano with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, CYCADA. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.